Thank you for being here with us. Lord Grimstone, I'm going to start with you right away. The UK is working on a free trade agreement with GCC countries, and you are playing a key role in the negotiations. So as someone who's involved in all aspects of it, give us a behind-the-scenes look at what's happening and how it's going. What's the progress there?
Yes, certainly. Well, good morning, everybody. Very pleased to be here. I think, first of all, it's easy to slip into lazy thinking and to think that the GCC is a strong organisation and all you have to say about the Gulf is the GCC. Whereas I think those of us who have spent many years operating there know that actually the countries are very different in the GCC. Of course, there is some common heritage, but the aspirations are different, the objectives are different. So one sometimes is rather lazy and talks about the GCC will do this, the GCC will do that. I know one of the Gulf chief negotiators very well, and he told me last month that the GCC spends more time arguing amongst itself as to what to put in a free trade agreement as they do negotiating with the UK about it. Because we have to remember that the Gulf is a customs union, but the only thing which is common across the Gulf is goods and a common external tariff. They have no agreement on services. They have no agreement on the recognition of professional qualifications. So actually, it's a very limited entity. Now, I think the advice that I give my friends there is that we have to be ambitious in these things. And one of the problems the UK has got is that the first two free trade agreements we did were with Australia and New Zealand. 32 chapters. This is like a Christmas tree on which you can hang many different coloured ornaments. And these free trade agreements, they deal with labour laws, with women's empowerment, with the environment, all great subjects, but not something that the GCC easily has competence in. So we are making progress. I encourage the countries to be ambitious, but also those countries who want to go further than other countries should absolutely be allowed to. Where Oman's interests are different from Qatar's interest, these differences should be able to be reflected in side letters, side agreements, etc., etc.
Because like you said, not all countries are the same. Saif, I want to come to you next, and just to get some global context here, what we were talking about in the last panel as well is sort of the GCC's positioning in the new global order. And of course, in the last couple of years, we've seen supply chains around the world being disrupted. We've seen trade routes being remapped. How has this affected the Gulf, in terms of creating new trading patterns, for example?
Yeah, so thank you very much, and it's great to be here. I think when I was listening to the earlier panel, unfortunately, they may have taken all our sound bites, so we might have to come up with more. But I think specifically on I think the global shift that we've seen on the supply chain finance patterns is really interesting. So as a bank, when we look back over the last 5 years, uncertainty has become, we have to bake that in. It's become part of norm. So whether it's COVID, whether it's Russia invading Ukraine, which happens to be, could be a war that was in East Europe, but the impact has been felt all over the world, right? With rising energy prices, rising food prices, economies as far as Ghana, Egypt, Pakistan have felt that impact. So I think the global impact of all these uncertainties are really affecting everyone. Specifically on the supply chain side, it is a very interesting one. We're a global trade bank ourselves. We see that. I was in China 2 weeks ago, and I think we've been hearing about the China +1 strategy. In fact, when I was there, I'm now hearing China +1, +1, +1, +1, because I think the diversification is happening all over. So the initial winners were seen to be some of the Southeast Asian countries, so Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia. But we're seeing that go further. We're seeing the nearshoring, onshoring, friendshoring, and so I see the GCC's role in this is a critical one, because it is sitting at the center of this world that we live in, right? So I think as we see, very progressive markets like the UAE opening up, they've been, they have an open economy, allowing free trade to come through. I think these markets can absolutely play a role. I think our friends from Oman who've been here for the past few days, I think they have a huge proposition to offer also, because many of the corporates, the large corporates, many of our clients are looking to diversify. They're looking to go into the home markets also and stay there. But I think the positioning of the GCC being really in the center of the world gives it a really critical advantage, which should be taken advantage of. I mean, it should be, should be used for the benefit, and even markets like India, which
Yes.
we, were not necessarily going to be seen as that, but they're benefiting from some of the diversification also.
And just a reminder to all of you to send in your questions. The QR code is there, so do participate. We do want to hear from you. Benjamin, I want to come to you next. We talked about diversification, and as countries in the Middle East look to diversify their economy, there is sort of a renewed push in new trade deals and trade routes, etc. What are some of the new trends your emerging trends that you're observing?
Well, I think what's interesting is that I think to an extent the pandemic concealed the way that in a number of very important new emerging sectors you have the GCC taking the lead. If you look at something like food security, if you look at the huge growth in food tech, both in novel foods, vertical farms, as we heard in the last session, you have businesses that previously would have seen the GCC as a place for them to export and to take their technology, are now actually thinking of starting and developing it within the region. So you have, you see significant focus, for example, in Oman with a business called Microtechnology, mushroom novel food business. You've seen the same, for example, in Qatar with an investment in Eat Just, which is a cultured meat business. And you've got big vertical farming businesses in the UAE and elsewhere with, for example, interesting offtake agreements with airlines and others, again, as we heard in the last session. So I think that out of the necessity of having to respond to obviously the very challenging environment that you have for food production in the region, you've actually now got the GCC taking the lead. You see the same in things like, for example, and this is an area that we're working in, things like e-gaming and in esports and gaming, where again you've got the GCC taking leadership positions in investing in, for example, the gaming business. The global gaming business is a $300 billion business. It's 3 times the size of Hollywood, and you've now got games being developed and grown in the region, which will be culturally sensitive to the region, that will be popular with local consumers, and will be able to grow internationally. Again, obviously a huge diaspora across the whole of the world that can be embracing these kind of businesses. And then obviously in renewables, again, originally out of necessity, but now an opportunity, both to develop new technologies, but also on the demand side to invest in local autos, in charging station and others, where you're going to see big changes and big shifts coming.
Thanks, Benjamin. Haitham, I want to come to you next. The Muscat Stock Exchange, again, in another effort to sort of integrate into the global economy, you've taken a big decision, and that is to remove restrictions on foreign ownership, right? Can you give me an update on how that's going, where you're at?
It is not just the Muscat Stock Exchange. As in 2019, Minister of Commerce has issued foreign investment law. And on that, it has dedicated that it's open 100%. It's not just related to the exchange, it's the whole country. So, and they have just specified certain activities that are out of the scope. And those activities are mainly the minor activities are into the local type of businesses, the smaller businesses. But the whole bunch, the whole license, the whole activities are open toward investors, 100%. And what we did in Muscat Stock Exchange is just taking the decision instead of the listed companies to open the investable cap to be 100% instead of 49%, which used to be earlier. So the whole country is toward having a full 100% ownership, along with the other programs that support Oman Vision 2040. Along with that, earlier this year, His Majesty himself has instructed to cancel the withholding tax on dividends. So although that we do have a specific situation where all the joint stock companies are listed, whether closed or publicly traded, So the closed joint stock companies was on a tax regime of the withholding tax. Now it's totally cancelled, and the uncertainty on tax has been removed.
Lord Grimstone, I want to come back to you and talk to you again about the free trade agreement that you are working on. There have been protests here in the UK around that, and there is a certain section of society that believes you shouldn't be having these conversations because of concerns about human rights abuses. I just wondered if you could respond to that, and should those kinds of conversations even be part of a business conversation?
Look, I think it's absolutely appropriate that when you're having dialogues between countries, those dialogues take place at a number of levels. You go back many, many years and things were kind of black and white. Somebody was either your friend or it was your enemy. Nowadays, relationships between states are much more multifaceted. So you can be a trading partner at one level, and you can be making representations about human rights, for example, at another level. And I think we should all do that. Obviously, there's cultural differences, there's other differences, and one can respect that. But there are some universal standards, and it's good that we talk about that openly, not with rancor, but in particular, not thinking necessarily that our way is the best way. And I do think in some of these dialogues, arrogance has crept into the West, which makes the continuation of these dialogues quite difficult. And if one is to make progress, one has to engage, and I have no problems about that at all. Obviously, if you come back to the nuts and bolts of trade, if somebody is using sources of labour which aren't market sources, and that is allowing goods to be undercut because they're being produced by, I'm not saying for a moment this happens in the Gulf, effectively by slave labour, absolutely appropriate that that's not part of any form of global trade agreement. But one should be able to have these kind of discussions in a grown-up way.
Yeah. Benjamin, I want to come to you next. We're talking about a trade deal between the UK and GCC. What about a trade deal between the GCC and China?
Well,
your expression says it all.
Well, it's clear that China is taking the GCC as a whole much more seriously than it ever took the GCC before the pandemic. It's obviously very significant that Xi visited Saudi in December. It was outside of his immediate neighborhood. It was his first trip since the beginning.
Because these talks have been happening for a long time, right?
They have, but I think the fact that he went there, and he took a huge business delegation. He took a huge Chinese technology business delegation, which I think also shows the direction of travel. It's clear that the Chinese no longer simply see the GCC and the neighboring countries as a source of energy. They see it as a source of innovation, as a source of ideas, and a whole wide range of different business uses. So it's difficult, as Gerry was describing, it's difficult for anyone to come up with an FTA with the GCC for all of the obvious reasons that we discussed. Are the Chinese going to get there? Yes, I'm sure they will eventually. But regardless of an FTA, China and the whole of Asia is taking the Gulf much more seriously than it ever done before.
And if I may,
yes, I was just coming to you next.
This is a bloc that has 55 million people, $16 trillion. Obviously, there's some big countries also. And if you include sort of the neighboring, Egypt, although they're not part of it, but if you include Egypt, that population goes over 100 million. I mean, it's a significant player. I mean, today, trade between GCC and the UK is about 35 billion. I think that has opportunity to double, within the next 10, 20 years, especially on the sustainability front, right? I think that's where, Saudi is playing a huge role in driving that. And so for us, we've been in Oman for, I think, nearly 55 years. And it's a business that, one that we're very, very comfortable in terms of, the setup of it. And we want to help drive the next phase of growth. I think yesterday we had a delegation of CEOs who came to visit us, and we heard about the great Vision 2060, I think, 2040, which is being driven by His Highness himself. And a cornerstone of that will be how to make it a sustainable growth, right? And this is where, for me, the GCC will really play a key part. Sorry, earlier on you talked about the corridors. I see now the GCC is creating, so the corridor between GCC and India is becoming an absolute active one, both sides. The corridor into Africa, I see the GCC countries playing a very, very important role. And of course into Asia, right? I think that we know, but these two corridors, especially into India and into Africa, is one that I see is very exciting. And I think the African countries are also realizing that if they get their free trade agreement in place, these can be very powerful blocks that are outside the norms of what we know of on the Western side.
Haitham, did you want to?
Yeah, it's good to mention that in terms of numbers, up to 2021 statistics, China comes in top list of the trades between GCC and China, then India, then Japan, then it comes, I think, Korea and the United States.
China, India, Japan.
So it's logical that China will show an interest. Again, back to what Benjamin has mentioned, technology and innovation is one of the new trends that happens in the GCC.
And I wanted to go back to what we talked about right in the beginning about the differences between the various GCC countries and this idea of competition between them or collaboration. And from where you sit, I wondered if you could comment on that and how either could spur trade and economic advancement in the region.
It's a fact, and it's my own opinion on that the GCC has different scales in terms of economics. So if you take the accumulative of the GDP of the whole GCC, Saudi itself will count up to 50%. Then goes to UAE, it counts to 23%, so it's almost half of that. Then the third one will be Qatar, which is half of that as well. So we are not in the same scale. So that really pushes us to work together rather than compete, because competing will be almost a bit tough. The competition that really happens, and back to Benjamin, that it's on innovation, the new trends, but on the current scales, most of the GCC sovereign funds are working together. That's a collective of almost 3.2 trillion US dollar collectively. And if you go back, 23% is the GDP of the UAE compared to the whole Gulf. But in terms of resources, they have the highest collectively because they have 3-4 sovereign funds. If you add it together, it will be even larger than Saudi. So the resources are not the same as well. So on the terms of what happens in the last 2 years, you can see the visits, the political relationship between the GCC has changed totally. It is now mainly not just a political, it's as well a commercial grounds where there are a lot of relations. And I believe logistics will be the top of that, being very connective to each other.
I want to come back to...
Sorry, if I just come in. It's pushed the countries to think about competitive advantage,
Exactly.
which they perhaps hadn't in the past. And you're taking Oman as a fine example of that. Oman is probably one of the best countries in the world for the combination of wind power, offshore wind, and solar. Yeah. So, and that gives it a real competitive advantage. So again, the important thing for all of us, for the countries themselves, for the investors, for the traders, is to see what are those sources of competitive advantage and how does one maximize them.
Exactly.
This leads us nicely into the next question, which is from the audience, and it's not addressed to anyone in particular, so whoever wants to take it, please do. How does Oman ensure its voice is heard in the Middle East without being dwarfed by Saudi and the UAE?
I think Haitham answered part of that.
We're going to let her.
But, for me, it's about cooperation, right? I mean, I think that breakdown that we just got in terms of the size, I mean, you're not going to be able to compete on some level, but I think if you're able to cooperate, create a regional hub from a tourist perspective or, from an airport hub perspective where, it could be Dubai, it could be Muscat. I think the cooperation angle has to be there. And the GCC is also playing a very important role from a multilateral partner perspective. We've seen that in countries like Pakistan, probably, in Turkey at some point. And they're influencing, they're going to influence policies. So I think as the cooperation gets stronger, I think the bloc becomes stronger as opposed to trying to do it each country at one at a time. So I hope cooperation really takes at the front of the sort of the agenda.
I think
I mean,
Oman
the
has,
voice of reason. The voice of reason.
I think
Should
Oman
be the
has
one most-
soft power that it doesn't deploy. It's a country that has a heritage, it has a history that goes back hundreds of years. It has a series of relationships thanks to its trading that again goes back hundreds, if not thousands of years. So it has an affinity and it has relationships across the globe that, with respect to perhaps others in the region, countries that were created in the 20th century down to European politics, can't have the same kind of relationship. And I think that Oman should really think about how it uses that soft power in that history in the way that it can really secure the kind of competitive advantage that Gerry describes.
Adding to that as well is Oman being a very stable politically, create a very, or eliminates a very high risk of uncertainty that happens with other markets.
Fair.
So it's a very stable. The connection with the GCC as well in terms of resources. So back to the GDP and the distribution between the Gulf and again on the resources available. Like if we talk about the minerals, we have only Saudi and Oman that really have good commercial stake of minerals. That's itself a good sector to focus on, where the other GCC will focus on trading. So we are complementing each other. Each country has its own way of pushing the other country.
Another question from the audience. How does Oman use their rising economic zones as a diplomatic tool to influence its foreign policy in the Middle East? May I come to you, Lord?
Yes, well, of course, one of the huge geographical advantages Oman has got, it's looking to the east. It's looking towards the Indian Ocean. And as we've heard earlier, again, this is a source of competitive advantage. So developing economic zones designed to maximize the utility of that is, again, one of the ways forward that one attracts investment.
But there are many economic zones.
Yeah.
That's true.
Probably too many.
In the neighborhood.
And
Everywhere.
the exponential growth of them is probably something that's going to have to be rationalized in the future, because as an inward investor and someone looking across the region, it is very, very difficult to understand exactly where you should be planting your flag, where you should be prioritizing. And I think if we think about the kind of things that in the future the GCC should be thinking about, it should be actually about thinking about the different kinds of coordination across these zones that is going to create a single standard level playing field that all inward investors can benefit from, rather than this hodgepodge at the moment, which is a little bit difficult to understand.
We're almost out of time, but very quickly, I know we began by talking about the volatility in the world, global shifting order, etc. And I just wanted to ask you, perhaps Benjamin, last word quickly to you. How do you build resilience into trading channels?
Well, if COVID taught us anything, it's that you've got to have resilience in your trading channels. And the GCC, just out of its geographic position, there's no better place to start. And I think that whether you're an inward investor looking at strengthening your position and your supply chains across the globe, or a local GCC business that's thinking of developing, you are a resilient and strong and stable partner for airlines, logistics business, shipping businesses. The GCC will only benefit from the recognition that the pre-COVID supply chains are never going to exist again.
On that note, we're out of time. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for the great questions.